Hello and welcome to this video tutorial on Unit 2.2, Cost Estimation. Be sure you have your handout as well as a pencil and calculator before we start. We're going to focus on using the high-low method to analyze mixed costs. Our goal is to determine the formula for a particular cost. First, let's review the concepts of variable and fixed costs because these are the basis for the high-low method. What effect does an increase in activity have on total variable costs? Hopefully you said total variable costs go up or increase directly and proportionately when activity goes up. How about the variable cost per unit? Well, remember, the variable cost per unit stays the same over different levels of activity. How about total fixed costs? Total fixed costs stay the same over different levels of activity. And finally, what happens to fixed cost per unit as activity goes up? Remember, fixed cost per unit is going to go down. It'll decrease indirectly and proportionately with changes in activity. Okay, now let's look at your handout. Here's the data we are given. Based on history, we know the cost the company incurred for maintenance over the given months. And we know how many maintenance hours were worked. Here are our hours, here's our cost. Remember, our goal is to determine the cost formula. Now think about these costs. Why did they change from month to month? Hopefully you thought because the variable part of the mixed cost changed. Remember, the fixed part stayed the same. The very first thing we do with the high-low method is to find the high and low data points based upon activity. Here we find the low is in February and the high is in June. We're only going to use those two data points in our analysis, so we're going to ignore the rest of the data for this method. Okay, on your handout you have the steps we will go through in order to find the cost formula given data like this. So once we've identified the high and low data points, our first step in the analysis is to find the variable cost per unit. We do this by finding the change in cost by taking the high minus the low and dividing that by the change in activity, which is the high minus the low again. So we take the $9,800 cost at the high level of activity, subtract the $7,400 cost at the low level of activity, and we get a change in cost of $2,400. We're going to divide that by the change in activity, the high level of activity minus the low level of activity, or 300 hours. This gives us $8 per hour. So our variable cost per unit is $8 per hour. The next thing we want to do is to use the variable cost per unit to find our total variable cost at the high and the low. Then we can find our fixed cost by subtracting. You don't have to do this at both the high and the low, but if you do, you should get the same answer, which tells you that you probably did it correctly. So here we have at our high level of activity, remember our variable cost per unit we just calculated at $8 per unit. Our high level of activity is 800 hours, so that means our total variable cost at our high level of activity is $6,400. Once we know our total variable cost, we can back into our fixed costs. Recall that at the high level of activity, our total cost is $9,800. So if we know that our variable cost is $6,400, then our fixed cost must be $3,400. Let's do the same thing for the low to make sure we got the right number. At the low, our activity level was 500 hours. So we multiply the 500 hours times the $8 per hour to get a total variable cost of $4,000. Subtract that from our total cost, and again, we get fixed cost of $3,400. So we know we did this correctly because we got the same $3,400 at the high and the low. The last thing we want to do is to take our results and write them in the form of a cost formula. In this case, our cost formula is total costs equals $3,400 per month plus $8 per maintenance hour. Once you have this, you can estimate the maintenance cost for any given month. For example, how much maintenance cost would the company have in a month where 900 maintenance hours are worked? Let's use the formula to answer that question. Pause the video for a moment to do the calculation. Hopefully you came up with the answer 10,600 using these calculations. Our cost in a month where 900 maintenance hours are worked will be 3,400, that's our fixed cost, plus the 900 hours times the $8 per hour, giving us $10,600. Now take a minute to pause the video and see how far you can get with example 2 without my help. Come back when you're finished or if you get stuck. Here is a situation where we have only 2 data points, so we know the high and the low. Remember that the first thing we'll do is to find the variable cost per unit by taking the change in cost and divide it by the change in activity. We take the 14,000 minus the 10,000 to get our change in cost of $4,000. We're going to divide that by the change in activity. 120,000 units minus 80,000 units gives us 40,000. So in this case, our variable cost is 10 cents per unit. The next thing we're going to do is to plug in the variable cost per unit to find the total variable cost, and then we'll use that to find our fixed costs. I'm going to do it at both the high and the low again to check that we arrived at the right answer. Since our variable cost is 10 cents per unit, we see that our total variable cost at the high is $12,000. We subtract that from total cost to get a fixed cost of $2,000. At the low, we find that our total variable cost is $8,000, 10 cents times the 80,000 units. Again, subtracting from total cost, we get a fixed cost of $2,000. The last thing we'll do is to write our cost formula. Salaries and commissions expense will be equal to $2,000 per month plus 10 cents per unit. So how much would this cost be in a month when 90,000 units are sold? Let's plug the 90,000 into our cost formula to find out. We're going to get $2,000 per month plus 10 cents per unit times the 90,000 units. So our total cost will be $11,000. Now you know how to use the high-low method to estimate the cost formula for a mixed cost. Once you have a cost formula, you can estimate costs for the future, such as in a budgeting situation, as we'll see later in the course. Now you can go ahead and work on your Unit 2.2 practice exercises.